All right, so tonight we're gonna attempt to get through 6 and 7. Part of the reason for that is we missed last Wednesday, and as I started to look forward, I've got 2 Wednesdays I'm going to be gone to Phoenix at the end of this month, Phoenix and California, and then just as we look through, I'm like, we're not going to be able to end on time if we just do 1 lesson per week. So when a good opportunity comes up to do 2 lessons together, we're going to do that. And this is one of those opportunities because it flows pretty well together because they have the whole life of Abraham together with Isaac. So that's what we're going to be doing tonight. So when we look at Abraham's life, we have first the fact that he is born in Ur of Chaldees. And I think we talked a little bit in weeks past about how there's a Jewish tradition that makes it where he's in Ur of Chaldees and his father is actually the owner of an idol shop. And, Abraham shows how good of a person he is by being monotheistic and not believing in any of the idols. And he shows his dad that he goes through and he breaks all the idols except for one and puts a stick in the hands of the last idol. And then his dad comes out and gets mad at him. He's like, no, that one did it. And so that's kind of a story that shows that Abraham was, this good guy. Now what we're going to figure out as we go through this tonight is that really that neat story, but it counters what Scripture is going to say in the fact that God did not choose Abraham because he was so good. He just simply chose him, and that's it. There wasn't a meriting of that, and we're going to see how that's even carried out even more in the lives of the patriarchs. So, Ur of the Chaldees. One interesting thing when you get to the passage and it says that, the Ur of the Chaldees, that is an anachronistic term. Now, does anybody know what anachronistic means? It means that it's out of the timeline. Yeah, out of place in the timeline. And so when you read that it's Ur of the Chaldees, and here's Abraham, and Moses is writing this, even at the time that Moses is writing it, there is no Chaldea. It has not come to be called that yet. So that's one of the places where we know that a scribe put that in there to make sure. Just a second, this is saying low battery as though it's not plugged in. That's plugged in. That's plugged in.
Orange extension cord plugged in. And that would be a no, I believe.
Didn't figure out where the other end of this is. Yeah, it doesn't help to plug things into something that's not plugged in itself.
There we go. Sound like a life lesson.
Something you need to tell every blonde, right? So, I am one, so I figured I can get away with that. So the fact that they call Ur of the Chaldees, it's probably a scribe that put that in, just like when we had the NIV version, and they'll put in the name, like every time that you read Egypt, if you get bothered by the Ur of the Chaldees, every time you read Egypt, the actual name is Mitzrayim in Hebrew. But if we started calling it Mitzrayim, everyone would be like, huh? So we update the names of places. So that's why it's Ur of the Chaldees. Some people say, oh, see, it shows that it was, not written when it was said to have been written. Don't worry, guys. When you're late, I don't do anything to shame you. So,
I just don't make eye contact.
Yeah, exactly. I know. They'll try to say, it says Chaldees, and it shows that that's, that was added in later. It's like, yes, there was a scribe that clarified so that because there are multiple Urs, there are places. Some would say that this Ur being talked about is actually north of Haran, which would be closer to Turkey. And so some have argued that, but we see that at least from this tradition, which is fairly ancient, that the Ur we're talking about would be the one that is in Mesopotamia. So what that means is that Abraham is in a city that is the largest city of his time, really, and one of the most developed. It would be under the 3rd dynasty of Ur-Nammu, and you had the rise of Sumerian culture following a dark age. So prior to this time, we find almost no archaeological evidence for people settling in this area. There's a time where it seems that a lot of cities had kind of collapsed, and then now things are starting to come back. And there's a rise of Sumerian culture in place of, I'm not going to remember what the other culture is, but so the Sumerian culture begins to take over what was the prior culture from northern area, like where Assyria is. You also have the development of written language during this time. You see these clay tablets here. That is what we find a lot of in archaeological stuff, is different clay things. And the way they would write is they had something similar to a screwdriver. They just tap, 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 and people could do it pretty quick. But that's how they made all the different marks, and that became their writing. So what we find in that writing is we find Ur-Nammu's code, which isn't as well known as Hammurabi's code. How many of you have ever heard of Hammurabi's code? Okay, some of you have. Hammurabi's code is so well known because it is basically a system of laws that has a good amount of commonality with the Mosaic law, in the sense that it forbids certain things like murder, and it tackles different civil situations and how you would handle them, and who would be able to who would be able to sue for what. Now, this is interesting because when you stop and think, especially if you're from a secular perspective, where everyone's evolving this, whoever thought of coming up with a thing called law? Why have a law? Whose right is it to have the law, and so on and so forth? So this is the very first written code of law that we find in all of human history, and that's why it piques a lot of interest. You also find during this time period a lot of artistic artifacts, as you can see here. The things that they're finding, they're not just basic stoneware. They show metallurgy, the ability to shape things, but also to go into the aesthetics, where you're actually having, like you see here with the shaping of the animal's head and the horns and things like that. So you're seeing artistic things come out. And because it's being made of gold and other things like that, it's a fairly affluent city as well. The picture that you see up in the top, that is the ziggurat that is there in Ur. And this is one of those large ones where it's like, was that the Tower of Babel? And, some would say, is that what it's talking about? But this actually dates to the time of Abraham. So if you were there and you could see this, you're looking at something that likely Abraham saw. And so you see all of this stuff is where Abraham and Terah and his family is coming up in. Now, it doesn't mean that they necessarily were right living downtown but they were in that area, and that's where they are coming from. One thing about when the religion, the main god of was Nama, and the goddess Ningal. But Ningal was the Sumerian version of the moon goddess Sin. Now, the reason why this is important and interesting is that Sin is also worshipped at Haran, which is where Terah and Abraham and Lot and all of them stop on their way over the Promised Land, and it's where Terah ends up dying. And some believe that one of the reasons they kind of stopped and stayed there was because Terah and others were worshiping this goddess Sin, and since it was another place where they were able to worship, they felt comfortable and stayed there. And this then goes with the statements later on in Scripture of your fathers who worshipped other gods beyond the river, and would kind of point and agree with that. So there's some ideas that that's why they stopped at Haran, although we're not told for sure. So Abraham is called to follow God. And he's called out of all of these other people all over the earth. It's just God says, here's a man, I'm going to start with you, and I got this plan that I'm going to put into play, starting with Abraham. And so why does God do this? And as we look through the patriarchal period, we're not going to go story by story because this is giving you the backgrounds of it. But one of the key things I want us to grasp when you go to study these passages is what's being communicated, what's the theology that is important in all of this. So one, he was called to set apart a people to God's name for the purpose of revelation. So God calls Abraham out, and his goal is, I'm going to show the rest of the world what kind of God I am by being your God. And they're going to see what I do for you and the faithfulness I have to you and to your descendants. I'm going to make promises to you. And he's going to bring out through this one man a nation that is going to have the Messiah, who he chose from the very beginning to fulfill his plan of redemption. And so therefore this whole theology that's being taught during this time, he's already starting to teach us about this plan of redemption through what he's doing with Abraham. And it's important to grasp this, because when we go through these stories and we talk about people saying, well, you can see Christ all throughout the Old Testament. It's not just prophecies. It's the fact that God is setting up the stage for Christ to come and to be understood correctly by what he's doing through all of this plan, starting with Abraham all the way through. And one of the big things that's going to come out of the era of the patriarchs that especially factors into our understanding of what God has done is this concept of promise. That God promises something and he fulfills that promise. We're going to see a couple of passages tonight where that directly plays into the aspect of our salvation and who we are and how we fit into it, especially as Gentiles. So the theology of the promise, the theology of redemption is going to begin to be played out. And as a result, one of the key things that God makes sure of during this patriarchal period is that we realize none of this is by merit. And that is why you might wonder, why didn't God simply start with Abraham and then that was Israel? Why do you have Abraham and then you have Isaac versus Ishmael, then you have Jacob versus Esau? Why even have those steps until you get to Jacob, who then becomes Israel? And we're going to see that there's theological things God is bringing out in each one of those steps during the patriarchal period. So why the place of his call? Well, first, you have the curse on Canaan that was in Genesis 9 that we looked at, where Canaan is cursed as a result of Ham's action of going in and looking at his father Noah. Now, with this, the going into where Canaan had settled, there is the sense of Canaan has already been cursed, and they are already at a place where they're said, you're going to be servants of your brothers. You are going to be in that place. Also, because of that curse, it seems that they went into sinfulness at a greater speed than the nations that were around them. One of the things that gets kind of confusing is that when you start going through this section, you have a lot of ites. You got the Canaanites, you got the Hittites, you got the Amorites, you got all these different ites that are there. And a lot of those are being called such because of their father, but you could have the Amorites are actually part of the Canaanites, and the Hittites are part. It's like, so they sometimes will use Amorites to be used of this group, and Canaanites. They're not exactly the same, but both can be used for them. And that comes into factor in the next passage as to why this place of the call. Genesis 15, we see, then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in the country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. And in the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So the Amorites here is also being used to the same people group that's there in Canaan. And what he's saying is that the judgment that is going to come through the conquest isn't deserved yet. It's going to be that strong of a judgment and that harsh of a discipline, and it takes 400 years for them to reach the level of sinfulness that deserves that. So it's interesting to see that that God, in his justness, he's going, I'm going to be that patient. I'm going to go that long, 400 years, until their sin reaches the fullness that deserves what happens at the conquest. This helps us understand a little bit why when we get to the conquest, and there are times where God is like, there's not supposed to be any mercy here. You were supposed to go in and wipe them all out. And they're like, wait, I thought God was a merciful God. Well, remember, he waited 400 years before he got to the point that he was going to do what he did there. And so in that sense, it helps us realize he was actually very merciful, and their sin was actually very great by the time that Israel gets to that place. So one of the reasons why they go in and they take that land is because it is the place of this people group. Now, this is one of the interesting things when you think about land today. We don't often today still consider that it is God's place to bring whoever into a land and take whoever out of the land. It's like, this is our land. Well, no, this is what does God want? Who does God want to have there? And we often will think of it that way, and that factors into how we interpret even some of what we understand from even American culture and the concept of manifest destiny. It was God giving this land to a different people group, and does God have the right to give that land to a different people group? And the answer to that is yes, he does have the right to do that. No land belongs to man, it all belongs to God. And he can grant that land to whomever he wants. So when you look at the Canaanites, the level of sin which they did resulted in God saying, you're out of that land, I'm giving it to the Israelites. But what happens when the Israelites, we just talked about this, during the reign of Manasseh, exceeds that of the Canaanites? What does God do to the Israelites? He takes them out of the land, and he gives it to somebody else. And so that's an important picture for us, to remember and to grasp. God is the one who owns the land. The other reason why he has Abraham going to this area is the strategic location. One, this land was dependent on God. We talked a little bit about this earlier, because God says that through Moses in Deuteronomy, the land which you are entering to possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you came, where you used to sow your seed and water it with your foot like a vegetable garden. But the land into which you are to cross to possess, it is a land of hills and valleys, and it drinks water from the rain of heaven, a land which the Lord your God cares, for which the Lord your God cares. And the eyes of the Lord your God are always on it from the beginning even to the end of the year. In other words, God is bringing them into a land where they have to be dependent upon him. If they sin, he brings a drought. It's an immediate thing. You can't just get over that drought by the process of engineering. You have to be dependent on God bringing the rain or not bringing the rain. So he chooses a land so that there's more immediacy in the consequences that he brings about concerning their sin. Also, exposure to national trade. This has often been brought up and is an important part, is that you have Canaan being here right where the three continents come together. All the major trade routes of the ancient world are passing right through that area, which later on aided in the spread of the gospel and the spread of the word of God throughout the world. So that was also an important part. So Ur of the Chaldees was here in Mesopotamia. There was a region that was controlled by Ur, and then a region that was influenced by Ur. In Susa, which is over toward what was and became Persia and Media, we actually find a stela of Naram Sin, who is king of Ur around 2230 BC, which is about the time of Abraham. And we found this stela that's showing him conquering this area. So we know that Ur has gone out and fought outside of just the immediate area where it's at, and is kind of ruling a small empire around this time. Which means that as Abraham travels here and continues on up to Haran, that's still in the area that was under the influence of the culture of Ur when he arrived there. Now, while they're at Haran, Terah, Abraham's father, dies. Back in Ur, Abraham's brother Haran dies, and so when they leave to go to Haran, It's Abraham and his brother and his father. At Haran, Abraham dies, and then his brother, name's escaping me. What's the other brother? Abraham, Haran, and I'm not going to remember. Terah's the father. Nahor. Is it Nahor? So the other brother stays in Haran, and Lot, Nahor's son, goes with Abraham and continues on to Canaan. Now this is important because the relatives of Abraham are back in Haran, and this then is where they are sending to find a bride for Isaac. This is where they're going to find a bride for Jacob. So when it speaks of that, that's how far they're traveling to go find the bride for the descendants of Abraham. So once they get to Canaan, Abraham continues on into Egypt and because of famine, and then heads back to the Promised Land. The conditions in the Promised Land at this time, one, there's an ease of movement, which fits with the sparse population. Now, you're going to read about kings and such during this time period, but these aren't kings of big nations. These are kings of cities, and the cities are not all giant fortress cities. And you can see that as to give you an idea, you have Abraham and his entourage, which we're going to find is actually sizable. He's a pretty sizable group going through the land. But as he is the sizable group going through the land, the kings of the cities aren't exactly a whole lot bigger in their groups. Otherwise, they wouldn't be negotiating as well with Abraham for the wells like they do. And there are other things that they probably would have just demanded if they had that much power. The patriarchs are always concerned about the cities ganging up together against them, but a single city they weren't that afraid of. So that gives you an idea that the cities were not large and huge, and that actually fits the archaeology that we find. The area of Sodom and Gomorrah was vigorously populated during this time. Jericho, as we said, is the oldest city we know of. But that's partly because we can't find Sodom and Gomorrah for sure, nor many of the cities that went with them. And we don't know exactly how everything changed at the time of Sodom and Gomorrah, which we're going to talk about eventually as well. But we do know that, from history that this area was more populated. Abraham's interaction with the various kings and the pharaohs fits historically as well. With this idea of the smaller kingdoms at this time. You have the nomadic tribes often making agreements with the city rulers, as we talked about, and nomadic leaders would remain in one location while others took flocks to good pasture. So what you're finding is a pretty good amount of freedom throughout the land. So what you would have typically with Abraham is he would find a place, he would set up his tent, but he had hundreds of servants that would actually take their sheep and their flocks and go all over the land to different places. Next week, I think, or the week after, when we talk about Jacob, you'll find that his sons are traveling a good distance with his flocks. When Joseph has to go find them, he's going a good ways to go get them. So they're traveling all over the land, just finding where the good pasture is. And so you do see a lot of flexibility and openness to move all around the land. Also, the land was a lot more fertile than it is today. If you go to Israel today and you drive around, especially some of the areas around the Jordan River Valley, you're like, this was fertile? This is what Lot chose over the other areas? You got to be kidding me. It doesn't look that fertile. Why is that the case? Well, because this area was inhabited for so long, and this is similar as well with Mesopotamia, they did not have the concepts of crop rotation. They didn't have the concepts of not taking out all the nutrients in the soil. You also have years and years, literally millennia, of conquests through this area because of where it's located. Every time an army comes in and conquers, They're going to build up fortifications. They're going to cut trees down. They're going to pull up a lot of stuff that helps hold the topsoil. And over all the years of rain and everything else going on, you lost a lot of the topsoil, lost a lot of the ability to hold that moisture. So what you see today is far less fertile and far less vegetated than it was back in the time of Abraham. So as you look at Israel today, this area is extremely dry. But even the valley of the Jordan is not as lush as it used to be. And if you look here, this is the border of the West Bank. Now, when I remove it, you'll notice you can still see it. You guys see that? Because you're right along the lines here. That is because Israel is going through an intentional process of returning topsoil, putting it back down, bringing the moisture, planting trees, trying to bring it back to the fertile level that it was before. And you can see by the fact that these are actually surviving that it is possible with the environment there for it to be more fertile. So odds are it would have looked a little bit more like this. I did my best to make it look natural, but you would have had a lot more green in the valley here and a lot more green in the hills and a lot more to for those flocks to be grazing on and trees to be used and so on and so forth. We're going to talk in a little bit when we get to Sodom and Gomorrah about why this may not be as green as it used to be, but that'll be for that section. The conditions in Egypt, because he goes down into Egypt. When Abraham goes down into Egypt, he's worried about Pharaoh taking his wife and killing him in order to take his wife. When they do get into Egypt, the very fact that he goes down into Egypt and the princes of Egypt notice his wife, and the next thing you know, his wife is being brought into Pharaoh, shows you how small this is. I mean, if this was a giant, highly populated nation, then you're not going to have Pharaoh noticing one woman, coming in. So you can see that it does match with a lot of what we see of some of the smaller kingdoms at that time. And also, we have from tomb paintings, in this one particular one, which is from about 1900 BC, we have actually a section of one of the tomb paintings where you can tell that these are Semitic peoples that are coming down into Egypt. Semitic, because of Shem, and that's what the Jews would have been part of, coming down into Egypt. Now, how can we tell that these are Semitic people rather than Egyptians? Anyone have a guess? Yeah. Well, if you thought, go ahead and say it. I haven't said it yet.
Yes, there'd be one key.
Yeah, the beards. Egyptians always shaved. So whenever you see Egyptians, they do not have the beards. They may have the little goatee, but these very clearly have the beards that go all the way up the sides. And so this is known as, or this is indicating that this is Semitic peoples that are coming into Egypt. So that, again, that supports that concept. Now, part of the reason why that's important is because there are people that are saying you didn't have any kind of crossover of cultures at this time, so that's why the biblical account can't be right, because Abraham wouldn't have gone down into Egypt. Well, no, they have proof around that time of people going down into Egypt. So the theology that's really coming out in the patriarchal period, you have the covenant promise and the faithfulness of God. So God is going to make promises to Abraham, and then we're going to see those promises, many of them, be fulfilled, some not yet. But as we just read the one passage, he's told this is going to be fulfilled later. But we do see many of the things like the blessing that is promised to Abraham. You see his growth in wealth. He says when Abraham heard that his relative had been taken captive, this is with Sodom and Gomorrah, he called 318 trained men born in his household. That's just not 318 servants he happened to have. These are 318 men born in his household, which means he has more servants than that. with more people from his whole household that are there. So when he moves around, he's got a large number of people. And these are the trained soldiers. We're not even talking about the younger ones that are shepherds or the older ones that are doing here or the cooks or the whatever. This is just the trained soldiers. And none of the females would be included in this either. And so you see that as he's walking around, that he is a pretty large group of people, and he is seen as being very wealthy as he moves about. The other big promise one that you see is the promise with Isaac. So Isaac, even though he has 318 trained men in his household, Abraham's going to go to God and say, yeah, but I don't have any kids. And so he doesn't have Isaac until he's how old? He's 100. So why? Why wait that long? We get the whole thing with Ishmael and everything else happening. And so what you see is the birth of Isaac is something that God intended to be miraculous. He wanted it to be something he had to wait, he had to see, and he had to get to the point where he knew this was not a coincidence. God promised you to have a child, and he has the child. The bride for Isaac. So the servant of Abraham who needs to find the bride for Isaac prays to Yahweh that he will find the correct bride, and he happens to go to water his animals at the same place that this girl comes up, asks him, can I water the animals for you? And it just so happens to be the relative of his master's relatives. And so it's like, wow, this is great. So God provides that spouse, again, bringing out the faithfulness of the blessing. The abundance of Jacob and Laban, when Jacob ends up going up to be with Laban, and he labors for 7 years for the one sister, and then marries the wrong one, and then labors another 7 years to get the one he wanted in the first place. That's during that entire 14-year period, Laban is blessed so much that he really doesn't want Jacob to leave because he's getting that much of a blessing. And then the blessing of Joseph in Egypt. When Joseph gets to Egypt, he rises in Potiphar's house, and even when that results in the jail time, he rises in the Pharaoh's household, and you see God blessing there. So throughout this patriarchal period in Scripture, you're seeing God faithful to that promise to Abraham of, I'm going to bless you. And you see that actively happening.
Question?
Yeah.
Since he had these many, maybe 1,000 people that he drew the 318 from, were many of those brought from Ur and Haran? Or are these people that were born or accumulated somehow during the relatively short time between his arrival there and the birth of Isaac?
So the question is, I'm remembering to repeat. So the question is, if there's almost 1,000 people with him, possibly, when did those people join him? Did they join him at Ur? Did they join him at Haran? Did they join him in the Promised Land? And the answer to that is because they at different stages they gained. But interestingly, though Abraham goes in and he lies to Pharaoh about Sarah being his sister, and he lies to Abimelech about Sarah being his sister, he actually comes out of both of those situations richer because they both realize he's a prophet. They both realize that he's a special man, and so in order to receive the blessing of the God that came to them in dreams, they give him wealth. So he actually gained some wealth from the two of them. He would have gained some wealth through trade and such as he went along. But we're not told a lot. We do know that it's happening to both him and Lot, because Lot and Abraham are existing side by side for a while, and then they reach a point where they have to separate. So we know that when they got there, they didn't already have to separate, but there was a blessing that was happening. So some of that could have been, in flocks, just the birth rate. The ones being born in his household, showing that he's blessing the whole household with the births as well. But there was pretty sure some that were also purchased and or given to him in other ways. So, all right. Another major theological point of the patriarchal period is God's sovereignty and his unconditional election. Now, when we think of unconditional election, we think of a debate that we have in New Testament about Romans and so on and so forth. However, when you get to the Old Testament, there's not a whole lot to debate about, because it's really clear that God chose Abraham. and he didn't choose any of the people around Abraham. And that's what elect means. It just means chosen. And so God chose Abraham. He didn't choose everybody else. And he makes plain that he chose Abraham based completely on his desires, God's desires, not at all based on Abraham and who he was, or Isaac and who he was, or Jacob and who he was. But not only does he just say, I didn't choose you that way, but the whole way the story plays out to prove that. And again, you think God's sovereign over these things. Why is he letting this Ishmael stuff happen? Because it makes a point, and he wanted to make that point. Why the Jacob and Esau? Why twins? Why didn't he just have one? Because he's making a point. This was intentional on God's part, and it shows his sovereignty over the story. So this is where we look and we say, are Jacob and Esau symbolic of something? They're not symbolic of something. They are something. God just wrote the story that way, said it that way. He's using the actual story that he is sovereignly bringing about in history to make the point. And he's capable of doing that. So part of the theology of this time period is showing God's sovereignty over all of these things and making some of those points. Now, when God chooses Abraham, he gives to him the sign of circumcision. And this was something where him and everyone in his household had to be circumcised. This meant that those 318 soldiers, who, even though they weren't descended from Abraham, they also were of the circumcision. And so you have that sign being given to them. Israel is not the only nation that circumcised in the ancient times. Anyone know one of the other nations that circumcised as well?
Egypt, I think.
Yeah. Egypt actually circumcises as well. And that actually goes to their favor at one point in one of the prophets, that they are kind of your brothers of circumcision and so on and so forth. And it was kind of interesting in that sense. You also see God's sovereignty in the wealth of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as we talked about. It's his blessing, but God is sovereign so as to make it happen. He's the one who brings about the whole circumstance with Pharaoh, where suddenly Pharaoh realized, oh no, I've upset this God, and so he's the one that's giving all this wealth to Abraham, and God's arranging for all of those things. You look at Jacob doing his really wacky peeling the bark with the sticks and putting it in front of his sheep thing. God doesn't sit there and go, wrong method. He just goes, okay, I'll bless you anyways, and just gives them a whole bunch of sheep. And it's not because of the sticks in the bark. It's just God being faithful and continuing to give wealth to them. And you look at it, if you really look closely, there's nothing given to us about the patriarchs' lives for us to go, I need to follow that, except for just believe that God's going to bless you. They're not changing the world. They're not evangelizing. They're not like feeding the poor. They're not doing anything that like you would think was necessary to get the blessing. It's like, no, God's just blessing them because he said he would. And all he wants them to do is believe that he will. And that's what you see. So God choosing some Joseph's rise in Egypt, also shows the sovereignty, while it was part of the blessing as well. What does Joseph say to his brothers when at the end, once they're sitting there going, oh crud, we're in trouble because Joseph now is actually alive and he's here and he's powerful. But what does Joseph say to his brothers?
God intended this because he was going to be there to bless them.
Yeah, God intended this. He says, you intended this for evil. God intended this for good. Now, what's interesting there, and I want you guys to catch, it's a interesting philosophical statement, and wow, that's powerful. But really think about that. God knew his brothers were going to do what his brothers were going to do, and he didn't stop his brothers from doing what his brothers did. And it didn't make what his brothers did okay, and his brothers will still stand before God and answer for what they did. Yet God knew how it would happen, knew how it played into his plan, and he allows it to happen. And that's important for us to grasp because he still works that way. He is still sovereign that way. He can allow things to happen to us and people to do things to us that isn't right that they did it to us, and they're not just going to get away with it, but yet he'll allow it because he knows what he's doing and he has a plan. And God's very plain about that when he says, I work all things to the good of those who love me and are called according to my purpose. He has a reason for all of what he's doing. And so that's brought out in Joseph's rise in Egypt, is that sovereignty that God had. He fully anticipated the famine, fully anticipated Israel would need those supplies in order for him to take care of the nation that he was bringing up. Then the idea that God chose some individuals and not others. Now, Abraham chosen, not as opposed to Haran or Lot or Terah or any of those, is just the straight up God chose Abraham, and that's just the very first theological point of God elects people, and he doesn't choose everybody. Then you have Isaac, but not Ishmael being chosen. And this is bringing out that when it comes to election, it is the children of promise that are the actual children that God is talking about. Now, while we read Isaac and Ishmael's story in the Old Testament, we're not fully aware of all of what's going to play out in the story when you get to the New Testament. But this idea of being children of promise is played out in Romans 9:8, as well as Galatians 4:21 and 31. So somebody, if you turn to Romans 9:8, and then another person to Galatians 4, and I'd like us to read these verses. So when somebody gets to the Romans 9:8 passage, just raise your hand, and I'll have you read it. Better not let those Awana kids see you guys going that slow.
Romans 8 what?
Romans 8, there's Romans 9:8. And the other one is Galatians 4:21. That's up here. Someone can get ready with the Romans 9:10 to 13 as well. So, anyone got it yet? Okay, Romans 9:8. Go ahead and read it.
In other words, it is not the natural children who are God's children, but it is the children of the promise who are regarded as Abraham's offspring.
Okay, so here's Abraham. He has Isaac and he has Ishmael. Ishmael was somebody who was the child not through Sarah, but through their efforts. Sarah and Abraham said, we don't have enough kids. We got to do something. Here's my maidservant. Have a child with my maidservant. So they're trying to accomplish God's promise through their effort. Okay? And that's not the child God meant. God says, I'm going to do it through the promised child. Now, these two situations is what Paul brings out in Galatians 4. So if somebody could read Galatians 4:21 to 31 for me. Yes, go ahead.
Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. For it is written, rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, ye who are not in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than those of the one who has a husband. Now you brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. But just as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. But what does the scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman should not inherit with the son of the free woman. So brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman.
Okay. Now what I want you guys to bring out, or to recognize in that, is that even the whole interplay that we're going to have with Hagar, where she has Ishmael, and then Ishmael mocks Isaac, and then Sarah gets upset and sends her away. And then you have God saying, no, go back to Abraham. And then later on, he has Abraham sending her away. There's a reason why God's doing all of that stuff. It's not just happenstance, and it's not just unfairness. He's communicating theologically a good deal of what is happening in the New Testament there. And when Paul says it can be seen allegorically, the point was this: the covenant with Sinai. What he's bringing out is that here was, with the way that the Jews took the covenant of Sinai in Paul's time was, here's God's promise. We have to go and we can do this. We can accomplish this. We will follow the law and we'll do this and we'll be righteous. Problem is, you can't. And so the only way that it can actually be fulfilled is through the promised coming of the Messiah and then the belief in the promise. And so you have to be children of promise, not just the children of Ishmael. All of this is being revealed in this story. Now, it's not allegorical because this kind of just happened and we wanted it to be allegorical. God wrote the story sovereignly that way. And so we begin to understand that and see that the theology being brought out with Isaac and Ishmael is that it is not the effort we do to try to accomplish what we think God's plan is. It is instead God fulfilling his promise to us and through us, and we just have to trust in the promise. And that's what I point out with the patriarchs. The patriarchs don't go out and do a bunch of stuff to earn anything. They just trust the promises of God. And then God did the whole story. End of story. And they're going to be in heaven with us. And it's important for us to grasp this because this pre-Mosaic law period is used a lot by Paul to justify you and I as Gentiles being able to be part of the people of God. And so it helps you a lot with understanding the New Testament when you grasp this. Now with Jacob versus Esau, this becomes important because of what we read in Romans 9:10 through 13. Because Jacob is chosen, not Esau. But somebody read for me Romans 9:10 through 13 as loud as you can. Go ahead.
Not only that, but Rebekah's children had one and the same father, our father Isaac. Yet before the twins were born or had done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose and election might stand, not by works, but by him who calls, she was told, the older will serve the younger. Just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated.
So what you have here is you have God saying, look, you have the child. When it says they're born of one father, that is a euphemistic English translation of what is actually there. In other words, what's actually there is a little bit more blunt and not always considered to be as proper, because it's basically saying from one single sexual act, these two children came. Now, why does that matter? Because there can't even be the accusation that while this child was being conceived, his parents had sinful thoughts, sinful something, but yet when this son was being conceived, his parents must have been in a godly situation, and that's why God chose this child instead of this child. It's saying, no, there is one sexual act so that there can be no merit anywhere by anybody. So you're saying, why did God have twins? Why do you have Jacob and Esau? Why aren't they both? Because God sovereignly brought about the situation of twins. He's the one that intended it to be twins. So that when the one is chosen instead of the other, we get communicated very plainly, God does not choose based on any human merit, not the parent's merit, not the child's merit. There is no human merit involved in it at all. And that's why this whole story happens this way. That's why you have, instead of just Abraham and starting off, you have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because these points had to be made by God, lest we understand the gift we have in Christ. And so he's bringing all of that stuff out through this time. So the theology of this time period is actually very important and foundational and used a lot by the New Testament authors to justify the teaching that they have. So Terah, who was the father of Abraham, Terah was the father of Haran, who was the father of Lot. Lot, as we're going to see when you get to Sodom and Gomorrah situation, their destruction, Lot has children through his two daughters. Through the one daughter, he has Moab, and through the other daughter, he has Ben-Ami. These become the father of the Ammonites and the Moabites. Terah, through Ishmael, he has 12 sons, and they become the Arab nations. Isaac, you have Esau, who has Edom, and you have the Edomians that come from that. And then Jacob has his 12 sons, and they become Israel. And then Abraham also, through Keturah, the wife that's not mentioned, and the descendants aren't mentioned here, she has also other children. The most important one, which is Midian, because he becomes the father of the Midianites. And then Esau, through the Edomians, he also has a son, Amalek, who becomes the father of the Amalekites. So the Amalekites, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, and all the Arab nations are all relative nations to Israel. And that will play into the entirety of the history of the Old Testament, as these nations, because of their close proximity to Israel in relationship, they're expected to have shown kindness to Israel. And when they don't, there's a greater punishment. And especially the Ammonites and the Moabites and the Edomites, that becomes the case. And we'll see that especially so in the Exodus. So also in the theology of the patriarchal period, we have the salvation versus substitutionary atonement. So you have the covenant sacrifice that's done. When God makes a covenant with Abraham, he has this process where they take these animals and he has Abraham chop them in half. And then Abraham falls asleep, and it says, when the sun had set and darkness fallen, a smoking fire pot and a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. That's Genesis 15, 17 through 18. Now, the significance of this, we know historically that a way of demonstrating a covenant was to take animals, to cut them in half, and you put them on the side where the blood would kind of flow in between, and then you would walk in between the halves together as a pair, the two of you making a covenant. And the idea was, whichever one of us violates this covenant, we will become like one of these animals. And so the two would typically walk through. The fact that God alone walks through and Abraham does not is this concept of God being the one who's going to completely accomplish it, not Abraham. And that Abraham does not have that same obligation as God does. God is saying, I will accomplish this, period. And then the sacrifice of Isaac says, as the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Father, yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. Now, in hindsight, once we have seen Christ, we look back on this and it's a clear picture. Now, prior to Christ dying on the cross, it may not have been so clear as that, but this very clearly is a picture of Christ going to the cross for us and God providing the lamb. And you have, the interesting thing is, this is the one thing, as we're going to see, this is the one act of Abraham that actually would almost seem to merit the blessing that follows it. Because you have not kept your son for me, here's the blessing. But we're going to talk about it in just a little bit as to how even that we point and understand better how God works in us to bring us to that point.
I have one more question.
Yes.
Comment. When John the Baptist pointed to Jesus and said, this is the Lamb of God, do you suppose he was thinking of the sacrifice of Isaac? Or is this something that he was unaware of and he was just making a statement? I'm trying to figure out the identification that he makes, and then the application to, obviously, to this picture.
Yeah, the question is that whether or not John the Baptist, when he says, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, is he looking back to the sacrifice of Isaac? I think he's looking back onto the sacrificial concept in the Old Testament period. And because God begins that here, but he unpacks it more in the law. And so I think in that way, the sacrifice taking away the sins of the world is something that would take this passage and the Mosaic passages together to see, I think. So another theology that comes out during this time period and for us to catch is the difference between pure monotheism and practical monotheism. We talked about this already once before. Am I correct on that? Well, I guess repetition is the king of learning. So pure monotheism is just there is only one God who is truly God, uncreated, creator of all things, and there is no other God. Like no other God exists at all. Practical monotheism is the sense of there's the worship of the one true God is supreme over other lesser gods. So the other lesser gods exist and they are there and they are real, but God is the one who is supreme over those. So there seems to be, in a certain sense, during this time period, a sense of God being the ultimate God, and that's their God, and they are worshiping because that's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're going to worship him, but the other gods are there and real, and others are worshiping them, and so on and so forth. And there isn't as much this sense of, oh, you have an idol, we need to smash it. And you can see that because Rachel, during this patriarchal period, she steals the household gods with her in order to establish that she's the heir, which we'll talk about that when we get to that point. But there's household gods that she just takes with her, and she has them with them. It's not like we're so monotheistic and we're following Yahweh, we got to throw out these household gods and destroy them. You don't see that during this time period. Nor do you have God saying to Abraham, I am the Lord your God, thou shalt not have any other gods before me. Now, it doesn't mean he didn't say that to him, but there isn't that same sense of pure identity of God as the one and only God in the full, pure monotheistic way. So you will see things, because people sometimes struggle when they read through the Old Testament. Why is it that David and Michal have this image that they lay in the bed? There's this idol that they lay in David's bed so he can escape from Saul. Why does Rachel have these gods with her? I mean, why is that the case? Aren't they monotheistic? And what you really have here is God is still teaching that theology to them. And they're still somewhat learning that theology as we go through this narrative. And that's why sometimes you'll see differences on that. True monotheism doesn't really hit us until the Babylonian captivity. That's what really entirely purifies the Jews of their tendency for idolatry, which may be why you get to the New Testament, now everything's a demon, not a god, because they've fully gotten to that point. There's God, and then there's all these lesser things that are just spirits, but they're not gods. And that's when they've reached pure monotheism as opposed to just practical monotheism. So the overall sojourning of Abraham, he came down through Israel. He first reached Shechem. Shechem is the one place when I went to Israel that I really wanted to go, but it was too dangerous, especially for the group. We only had 4 in our group, so it was way too dangerous for only 4 people to go. 6 months before we got there, they had a family that had been taken captive and killed, and we're like, yeah, we're not going to go to Shechem. But Shechem is probably the one place. If you're going to say you're going to go one place in Israel, where would you go? I would go to Shechem. You say, why would you go to Shechem? One, lots of stories happened here. Abraham builds an altar here. It's the first place he builds an altar when he gets into the promised land. This is where Jacob's sons killed the entire city of Shechem over their sister's violation, their sister Dinah. You have as well, this Shechem is nestled right between Mount Ebal and Gerizim. So Joshua went here with the Israelites and read the law on both sides of Mount Ebal and Gerizim, right where Shechem is. There are other things that happened here in Shechem, but then the other major one is this is basically where Jesus is sitting down with a Samaritan woman talking with her, and right above them on Mount Ebal is the or Mount Gerizim is the Samaritan temple, that they worshipped on and stuff like that. So there's tons and tons of stuff that happened at Shechem. And just to be there and to know Abraham saw this. I know for sure Jacob saw this. I know for sure Jesus saw this. I know for sure David saw this. I know for sure Samuel saw this. I mean, just, all these characters stood there and saw that scene. That'd just be amazing. Anyways, side note, Shechem's a great place to go if you feel safe enough to go there. Then he goes on from Shechem after building an altar there. And he gets to Bethel and he builds an altar at Bethel. By the way, this being referred to as Bethel is another anachronism, because it's even anachronistic for Moses to some extent, because this is not really, it's not for Moses. This is anachronistic for Abraham because it's not named Bethel until when? Anyone know when? So this is where Jacob has his dream of Jacob's ladder going up into heaven. And so he calls it Bethel, which is house of God, Bethel. And so house of God. And so before it was called something else, but it's referred to as Bethel by Moses. Then he travels down into the Negev and eventually into Egypt because of the famine. When he comes back, he is in the Negev for a time, but he eventually gets back up to the area of Bethel. And it's when he is here in the area of Bethel again that he and Lot have to part ways. Bethel, he actually set up between Bethel and Ai. So those are pretty well-known cities to us usually because of their story in the conquest. Ai is a little bit closer down to about right here, so they're nestled in between there. And so while they're there, they take up too much space, and Abraham is saying to Lot, "Why don't you choose?" Now you can stand at Bethel and Ai, and you're looking down into that Jordan Valley. You can see it. It's close enough to do that. In fact, you can stand right here, and you can see Jerusalem up here. You can see at least the amount of olives on the one side of Jerusalem. So when it talks about them standing and looking and seeing the land, Lot looks down into the valley of the Jordan and sees that it is a great place. It seems a lot more lush. And there are the cities. It's probably great shopping malls. They probably even have a Costco down there. So they're going to go and move there. So Lot goes down into the area of the cities of the plain, and then you have Abraham going on to Hebron. And Hebron is where now you have the burial place of Abraham and Sarah and so on and so forth. So there's actually a monument at Hebron you can go to where Abraham is buried. And so that I did not get a chance to go to because similar to Shechem, it's at a place that's not always safe in the West Bank. Now, the cities of the plain, Sodom and Gomorrah, and then there are 3 other cities that are mentioned. Where this plain is, most people are placing them further down here. Now, that does not seem like a very lush place today at all. However, that's because we don't really know and understand how much upheaval there was at the time of the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah and everything that happened. And so it seems that there is evidence that other things could have been more fertile in this area. There may have even been a river that flowed, this way at the time that no longer flowed and stopped flowing. So we don't really know how lush that area was, other than the fact that Lot thought it was far more lush than it is today. During this time, while Lot is there, we hear of this attack from the Mesopotamian kings, the king of Goyim, which we don't really know for sure where that is, or Elisar. Shinar we know, because Shinar is the plain where the Tower of Babel was built, and we know that's over in Mesopotamia. And Elam is over in Iran, and Elam is a word or a name for that area that's used frequently, so we're pretty sure that would be accurate. Now, what is often said is that for these kings to make an attack all the way over into the land of Israel would just be unheard of, because there wasn't any empires and such like this at this time. But when kings made attacks like these, they didn't do so to conquer. So during this time period, you don't have kings doing major conquests in order to just rule over an area, except for what might be immediately around them. What is very common, and you'll see is still common during the period of the Judges, because the Amalekites do it and a few other nations are doing it, is raiding parties. And so what you do is you wait until everybody else has gathered in all their crops, and you're like, yay, then you run in there and you can capture all their crops and run back. Then you don't have to grow crops. You got more than they do, and then they can't. So this is typically what is happening. So these kings that are coming in, they're not coming in to conquer the area and to rule over it. They're coming in to rob and to steal. So they go in, they're going to take stuff, and that's what they do. They go into Sodom and Gomorrah and these cities. The people in the cities, if you read the stories, the people in the cities and the armies, they all flee. And so then they take captive what they can out of the cities. And one of the things they take captive is Lot and his family. And so, after they've come in and they've attacked through this area, they come up through, they attack the cities of the plain, they take captive Lot and his family, and they begin to head north. But Abraham gets wind of this, and this is when he gathers those 380 some men, and he follows them. And you can see he pursues them from Hebron, and he catches up with them north of the Sea of Galilee. That is about, I'd say it's about like from here to my hometown of Grand Rapids. So, maybe here to the Wisconsin border, if you're trying to figure out how far that would be to travel. I'll be off a little bit on that, but that's a general idea of how far that is to travel, if even that. And so he goes, he catches up with them, and he defeats them. Now, the fact that he's defeating these armies of 380 some men, I mean, granted, God is fighting with them and blessing them, but you can still tell this isn't a huge, massive army to have conquest. This is a raiding party put together by these different kings that they come in and they do this. So this is probably just like 5 cities from that area put together a group to go raid and take captive and take riches and wealth back from all of their raiding. It's after Abraham does this that he gains all the wealth from Sodom and Gomorrah, as well as from the what they captured from the kings, or actually he gains the wealth from what he captured from the kings. Sodom and Gomorrah want to pay him a reward, and he refuses to receive the reward because he does not want any of the credit for his wealth to go to them. Now, this shows you that Abraham knows and understands that the blessing he has received is from God and is playing a purpose. That's why he's turning it down and saying, no, I'm not going to have you said that you made me rich. And so then when he does that, he takes from what he did receive and what he took captive, and he tithes from that to Melchizedek. So it says in Genesis 14, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. So here's this priest of God Most High coming out of nowhere. And who is this Melchizedek? In Psalm 110, 1 through 4, to David, the Lord says to my Lord, Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord sends forth from Zion by our mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will offer themselves freely on the day of your power. In holy garments from the womb of the morning, the dew of your youth will be yours. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Now this, because it is being said to David and the fruit of who would be descended, from him, then this is seen as a prophecy of Christ, that Christ is going to be a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. This is picked up by the New Testament author in Hebrews, and he says, For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, and to him Abraham apportioned 1/10 of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness. So Melchizedek, Malach is Hebrew for king, and Zadok is Hebrew for righteousness. So Melchizedek is basically king of righteousness. And then it says, and then he is also king of Salem, that is king of peace. So it says king of Salem, and some people say, well, that was probably Jerusalem. And so they think that he was coming from Jerusalem. But what we know later on is Jerusalem is under the power of the Jebusites. We don't know if it's called Jerusalem at that time. And so king of Salem would mean king of peace. Shalom, you've heard that before. And so Shalom is the same thing. And so it says he is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. See how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarchs gave 1/10 of the spoil. Now this is where it gets complicated. So who is Melchizedek? Is he a man, or is he a pre-incarnate Christ? Because it says, see how great this man was, you could say pre-incarnate Christ, but then Christ was a man when he came too, so how would we say that. It says he resembles the Son of God and he continues a priest forever. So not that he was a priest. Now, what you can argue with the no father or mother is that, well, we're not given a genealogy. He doesn't have his priesthood based on being a child of Aaron, which is the argument that's being made in Hebrews. Hebrews is trying to say, look, we know that Jesus was not descended from the tribe of Levi, and we know he's not a direct descendant of Aaron. But he still can function as a priest because God said he would be made a priest in the order of Melchizedek, who didn't have any genealogy to support why he was a king. And so since that promise was given in Psalm that a descendant of David would be given that right through this order of Melchizedek, that's how it vindicates that Jesus can not just be our king, but our high priest as well. And that's the argument that's being given by the author of Hebrews. So some people still argue that Melchizedek was just a normal man functioning as a type of Christ. In other words, he symbolized Christ, but it was not Christ himself. I lean a little bit more towards the fact that he was in the actual appearance of the pre-incarnate Christ, but neither is important to your salvation in the sense of, and you'll find things going back and forth. But the very fact that he continues as a priest forever is part of what makes me think that this would be pre-incarnate Christ at this point. So, a few things about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is that we have found some ruins in this area where we see evidence of destruction. You see the skeletons that are there that normally would be buried when somebody dies. They would take up the bones. They would burn the bodies. They take up the bones, put the bones in little boxes, and that's kind of how you buried people in ancient times. So the bones there show that there was a disaster that buried them, and so on and so forth. I've seen video, and the hard part is you can't always just travel there and prove everything yourself. But I saw a video of a guy. He's there, goes up to the wall, and you take these stones, these white stones, and it's white sulfur, which, by the way, if you are a chemist, you'll notice what color is sulfur usually. Anyone know? Yellow. So usually sulfur is yellow. White sulfur is fairly rare. And so, but you're able to take this white sulfur stone, pluck it out of the ground, and just light it on fire, and it just burns. So the idea of the brimstone being there, we find what you would expect to find. Does it absolutely prove all of that? No, but you would find what you would expect to find, and there's actual evidence of a very rare form of sulfur that fell at that time that is like that. And when you look at this, the upheaval, remember, it's not where we know that there's that rain of fire coming down, but there was also a very large amount of smoke that was coming up. It says Abraham looked in that direction and saw smoke is coming up from a furnace. And so there was a huge amount of smoke and destruction that is going on. This place is, by the way, extremely prone to major earthquakes. There was one during the reign of Jehoshaphat. But this is on the Great Rift Valley that stretches from here all the way down through Africa. And so it's a major, it's like, it tops being on the San Andreas Fault, if that helps you guys. And so the idea of an upheaval and great destruction and this fire raining down upon them, having a drastic effect on what the result was, like how much vegetation is left, has it changed? Has it, have you stopped up the spring of a river that used to, be fertile to that area, and that's gone now. So that now this area ceases to be fertile, ceases to have any supply of water, and God just basically destroys it. Now, you'll have this reference throughout the Old Testament that all the nations know about Sodom and Gomorrah. That they became a byword to the nations, and all the nations knew and remember what God did at Sodom and Gomorrah. And I feel personally, by the way it's referred to, that you actually had a pretty nice, beautiful, rich area here that God just utterly destroyed, capped off all water going to it, and cursed it for the rest of its days. And that's why to this day, nothing can live there. Even the sea that it is on, nothing can live. That's why it's called the Dead Sea. although one of my favorite jokes when I know somebody is, we'll say, more experienced in life, is to say that they were alive when the Dead Sea was still sick. But it's a fun one. But yeah, so this whole area is devoid of any type of richness of vegetation, and I feel that is because of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and that it was not like that prior to it. So with this, Abraham interceded for Sodom and Gomorrah. It reveals the effect of a righteous remnant on the heart of God. We talked about in the sermon a couple of weeks ago. If there are just 5 that are righteous, then God would have abstained from destroying it. But it also reveals the extent of the saturation of Sodom and Gomorrah's haughtiness. And haughtiness, we're going to see, is one of the biggest issues that happened here at Sodom and Gomorrah. And this is going to factor a little bit into our arguments about homosexuality today, because obviously Sodom and Gomorrah is one of the big things that gets brought up in that discussion. So with the rescue of Lot from Sodom and Gomorrah, God reveals his action toward the ungodly versus the righteous. So in 2 Peter 2, 7 through 9, and this is something for us to meditate on, especially the series of Habakkuk, and like, what if God's judgment does come, is that God is able to rescue his people out of judgment. He did so with Noah, he did so with Lot, and he can do so with us. So whatever he does and brings to judge a nation, he is capable of keeping us out of that and separating us from it. So it shows that God is righteous himself in that. In other words, he is just in not including the righteous in a punishment against the unrighteous. The demise of Lot's wife, pointing to the dangers of loving what God hates. You see that. We talked a little bit about this last week in the sermon about wealth and that deception of it and how it pulls on you and how you want it. And what you really see is that at work in Lot's wife. She's leaving. She knew the wickedness. I mean, she stood there and watched as the men of the city tried to take these angels away and violate them. So she knows all of those things, but she still looks back longingly at the city. Now, what about Lot? How did Lot feel about Sodom and Gomorrah? Do you guys remember? It says in Peter where Lot was at. It says that Lot was tortured in his soul because of the sin that was going on around him. So Lot was there and he hated it, but his wife was kind of enjoying it. And so she turns back and longs for it and ends up meeting the fate of being turned into a pillar of salt. The actions of the daughters. So basically, this may seem like really strange and really often like something's wrong with these daughters, but it also points to the seriousness of the destruction that's going on. The daughters get done with seeing what they've witnessed and they say, we're the last people on the earth. So they get their dad drunk and they have kids through their dad. Seems really, really strange, really, really weird. But it also points to how drastic of an upheaval it was that overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. They honestly thought they were the last ones on the planet. And so out of that relationship, though, you have Moab, who is the father of the Moabites, and Ben-Ami, who is the father of the Ammonites. Ammonites, by the way, what's the capital of Jordan today? Ammon, Ammon. Yep. So that's where that comes from. So what was the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah? So Genesis 19, 4 through 9, there's the mistreatment of the visitors. So today some people say, well, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was not homosexuality, it was lack of hospitality. Men of the city demanded to know the visitors, and in response, Lot offers his daughters who had not known a man. So you know that the way they want to know the visitors is not just, hey, can we ask you what your name is? They're asking to have sexual relations with the visitors. One funny story a little bit with this is the homeschool group that we were with, they had this this video that they were playing from the founder, and she was trying to encourage us to study math, and she's like, I want to know numbers like Adam knew Eve. And we're going, I guess you must really like multiplication. So, so the knowing the visitors meant that they wanted to have sexual relations with them. In Ezekiel 16:49-50, what we find is this explanation of what's going on with Sodom and Gomorrah. And he said that they were proud, they had an excess of food and prosperous ease, and they did not aid the poor and the needy. And so many of the people say, well, see, that's why they were destroyed, not because of homosexuality. But what it says is that because they had this excess food, prosperous ease, they didn't take care of the poor and the needy, and they were haughty, and they did abominations. Okay? So what is supported is that the act of homosexuality, but actually this just driven by sexuality, is this abomination. Now, when you look at the sin of homosexuality and what is happening today, it's important for us to realize that is an abomination. It is sin. But it's actually coming from the same sins that are mentioned here concerning Sodom and Gomorrah. The pride and the excess of food. What does excess of food have to do with the rise of homosexuality? Wealth. So excess food, wealth, prosperity, what does it have to do with the rise of homosexuality? You gotta have something to do. I think I'd choose other things, but yeah. What you have is when you have plenty, you don't have a fear of the Lord. When you have plenty and you're getting by and you're able to do it on your own, and you don't have this fear of like, if I'm not pleasing to God, if I'm not pleasing to the gods, whichever, then I have to be kind to people. I have to do this thing because otherwise the gods will be against me. But if I'm just rich and I haven't been paying attention to the gods and I don't care and I'm still getting by, then I don't have any fear of the gods anymore. And so I'm left to behave however I want and to be whatever I want to be. And that's where we're at today. We have been able, through science and all the other things that we have, to get to a point where we don't think that God's the one that determines our weather. We don't think that God's the one that takes care of our crops. We think we're doing it through all of our irrigation and all of the stuff that we're doing and our modifying everything. It's like we're able to do that. And so I don't have to worry about God anymore. And when I don't have to worry about God anymore, I can do whatever I want. That's why you see what's happening in our nation. But it's not just homosexuality. It's all of our sins. All of us have a sin here or there. Now, we often will jump on the one of homosexuality because that's one we will all more naturally be against. Because even unbelievers, when I went to high school, the ones who were actually mean to those that were of that bent were non-believers. They were the ones that were cruel, because even non-believers have a strong distaste for that type of thing. And so it's easier for us to be against it. But it was not just that in Sodom and Gomorrah. They had food, they had prosperous ease. They weren't taking care of the needy. They didn't care, and they did whatever they wanted. And God said, really? And so he brought them to this utter destruction. So the haughtiness and the lack of generosity was definitely a part. It led to the sexual perversion, because those are the abominations that were found. But also, so we know Jude 1:7 very clearly points to the sexual immorality as a primary sin that was there. But the haughtiness is such a great word in many ways, but the haughtiness is just, talk to the hand. I mean, that's kind of a haughtiness. It's, I don't have to listen to you. I don't have to pay attention to you. I don't have to care. So, theological implications with Sodom and Gomorrah is that Sodom and Gomorrah revealed God's thoughts and ways to Abraham so as to prepare him and his children to keep the way of the Lord. In other words, God wanted Abraham to see and for it to stick in the history of their nation what happens when you go that direction. What's interesting later is that within the prophets, there's almost this point of God's going to have to go back and apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah if he doesn't judge you. And you see that kind of tone a couple of times because Israel at times gets to that point. They become a marker of wickedness against which others are measured throughout Scripture. And they demonstrate the sovereignty of God in the permanence of their demise. When he said, you're done, and no one has lived there since. By the way, so one of the interesting things, how many of you have gone to Israel before? Okay, you get there and you go around Galilee. How many of those cities that Jesus was in are still cities with people living in them? Capernaum, not actually a city. You go to these Bethsaida, not a city. Why? Because what did Jesus say? If what had been preached in you had been preached in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented a long time ago. And as a result, you will not be inhabited. And they haven't been. Folks, that's 2,000 years of fulfilled prophecy that should amaze us, if nothing else. Because he said that. And for Jesus to say that, that far long ago, and it's a beautiful area. There's no reason why they shouldn't be built up there. But they're not. Yeah.
I studied this some time ago, and I don't remember all the details, but I think it mentioned Sodom and Gomorrah in the scripture 16 different times, including Old and New Testament references. And in virtually every case, it was, like you say, a marker of wickedness. It was a warning. It seems like God has taken that illustration that he did, action that he did, and made it the illustration to say this is how bad you can be punished if you want to continue in your sin.
Right.
And these other nations, even the children of Israel,
we're
told that if you don't respond, you're going to have this same kind of a judgment upon you.
Yeah. So what Judean said was that it occurred. You say 16 or 60? 16. 16 times Sodom and Gomorrah comes up, and it's always a measure of wickedness. It's always, that this is how bad it is. And this is something for us to, very important for us to grasp, both for our own understanding as well as for how we understand our current day. Whenever we see something like Sodom and Gomorrah, God is saying, by the way, this is what it actually deserves. I don't always pour it out. But when I do, you can see what it actually deserves. And so when we look at where we're at today with some of the struggles we have, it may not be something where it's like, well, how come God isn't doing this? Well, we still actually deserve that. It's just he's not pouring it out. And that's why it's that measure of wickedness that God can point back to, but he doesn't always just do it immediately, because he's pointing back to it and saying, by the way, this is how bad you are. You need to know that, because you need to know that's what you deserve. But he's still being patient and merciful and not immediately carrying it out. Thanks for bringing that up. Sodom's restoration in Ezekiel 16:53 demonstrates the richness of God's mercy. So he's saying in Ezekiel 16, it says, your older sister Samaria and your younger sister Sodom, which is interesting that it says it in that order, will be restored with you. And that's a punishment to Judah, because they thought they were so much better than northern Israel, and they had been haughty and thinking they're so much better than like Sodom and Gomorrah. But God is saying, no, I'm actually going to restore them with you. And I feel that particular prophecy in Ezekiel, the restoring Sodom with you, is actually pointing somewhat to the Gentiles, because you had the Samaritans kind of pointing to the northern Israel and the other part of Israel that they had been haughty over, and then Sodom is the representation of the Gentiles. And so the fact that the Gentiles get restored together with them in the end is a punishment against Judah in that particular prophecy. So, Abrahamic covenant. I don't think we're going to get through both lessons tonight, but we'll do what we can. And if not, you guys have your lesson all set for next time. So what was promised? Land. So you have earthly land being promised. Genesis 12:7 being brought to Abraham. I'm going to give you this land. There's also the heavenly, though. Hebrews 11:13-16 says that he was looking forward to a land and to a city who is not built by the hands of men. And so there was a sense that Abraham knew, I feel, because Jesus also says, Abraham saw my day and rejoiced. So I feel that Abraham being the friend of God, and that being emphasized, that at some point God did explain to Abraham all of the stuff, that the land and what it would represent was actually had a greater fulfillment in the end. And Abraham, I feel, understood that by that point. Seed. So there's the immediate. So there's the promised child, Isaac. That was a fulfillment of that seed. But long term, his seed became many nations, great nations, and the nation of Israel specific. Blessing. There was the immediate blessing in Abraham's life that you saw him, as we've talked about. But but long term, that all the nations that would bless those that came through him would also be blessed, and that the nation that came through him would be blessed as well. So the 5 occasions when this was brought out, so Abraham's call to the land of promise in the first place was the first mention of the promise of the land and the seed and the blessing. So God appears to him then when he arrives in the land and says, this is going to be yours. That was at Shechem, and that's where he builds that one altar. When Lot and Abraham separate at Bethel, then he is again mentioned the land and the seed, and told that you will be as the dust of the earth. And then it's at that time after that that Abraham then goes and settles at Hebron. And then Abraham delivers Lot from the 4 kings, and he once again is promised the land and the seed and the blessing. This time the seed is emphasized more, and Abraham questions God. How? He's like, great, give me all this blessing. What I really need is a son. And so God says, then you will have a seed that is going to be your very own son that comes from your flesh. And that's when he seals that with the fire pot and the flaming torch walking through those animals. Then just prior to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the seed and the blessing is brought up again to him in Genesis 17. And the Lord appears to him when he's 99. And this is when his name is changed to Abraham. And then this is the first time a behavior is called out for in the covenant context. Walk before me and be blameless. So prior to this, it's been promise, 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 promise. No call to act a certain way. And then this is the first time we see walk before me and be blameless. Circumcision then is given at this time as a sign of God's covenant, which would be one way that he would walk before him and follow an instruction. So we have something to actually do for the first time when circumcision is given in Genesis 17. Then you have, following the near sacrifice of Isaac, you have the seed and the blessing being given. But the first time, this is the first time that behavior factors into the cause of the promise. Is because you have obeyed my voice. Now what I want you to be able to process here is that Romans speaks of God, working in Abraham's life so that Abraham was persuaded to believe. Okay? So what you have is God first showing up to Abraham and just saying, here's my promise. And Abraham's okay, and he just believes the promise. But there isn't this behavior he's calling upon him to do. And he just continues to bless him, continues to work in Abraham's life. And Abraham begins to see God's sovereignty. He sees God's blessing. He sees that his God is actually sovereign over all. And his heart becomes persuaded to believe all of what God is saying. And then when God gives the covenant to Abraham of circumcision, he doesn't have a problem following through in that because he's believing already what God has said, and he follows through. And then when God asks him to sacrifice Isaac, we know from Scripture that what it says later on in the New Testament, that Abraham knew that God could just raise him from the dead, and so he believed. So because you have obeyed my voice, you would sit there and say, well, then God is doing this, but he obeyed the voice, which demonstrated the belief he had. So you'll notice God brought the belief through his own working in Abraham's life and persuading him to believe. So it was the work of God that brought about the faith, but the faith still brought about obedience. And that's a very important picture for us to grasp because it factors into our understanding of obedience in the New Testament, especially Romans, which begins and ends with statements of the obedience of faith. That's what it is. It's brought up in the beginning of Romans, brought up at the very end of Romans, and it's what Paul is pointing to, and he uses Abraham as the primary conduit for explaining that. So, what do we got? 752. Is this the beginning of the second lesson, or do we already get into the second lesson? I don't have the lesson in front of me. Okay, so you guys good with going till 8? No one's fallen asleep on me so far. So, all right. So we'll see how far we can get and how many slides. I don't get too many slides. Well, 10 slides. We'll see what we do. So, with Isaac, the order of events, God promises Abraham a physical heir. Sarah and Abraham seek to accomplish this through Hagar. We talked about that before. Hagar runs away from Sarah's abuse, but is met by God blessed and told to return. And that's one of the interesting things, because later on, God's going to have her sent away. But part of the reason that she's told to return brings out the entire situation of that Paul refers back to, is that Ishmael persecutes Isaac, and Paul points to that, and that's used in that whole thing. But there's this because at this point you don't have Isaac. There's no Isaac that's there, and so Hagar goes back. Sarah was just jealous because Hagar had a child and she didn't. So then God promises a physical heir through Sarah, and then Isaac is born and persecuted by Ishmael, which brings out a picture of what ends up happening later that Paul uses. And then God agrees with Sarah that Hagar and Ishmael are to be sent away. Now, at this point, when they are sent away, this is important, because when Abraham does the near sacrifice of Isaac, what does he say? Because you have sacrificed your son, your only begotten son. It's the exact same word in the Greek version of the Old Testament. It's the same word you find in John 3:16. Your only begotten son. And you'd say, wait a minute, that's he had Ishmael. But it's like, this is that promised, the one and only son. And because that officialness of the being sent away is there, it's the only begotten son. Ishmael is born through Hagar, Sarah's maidservant, represents trying to achieve the promise through her own strength, which is why it was used in that passage in Galatians. And God has him sent away. But, and this is the thing, God has this plan. He's doing this plan. He's accomplishing it. But here are these people, Esau, Ishmael, they don't get chosen, but they get blessed. And you'll see that God actually pours out onto Hagar and pours out onto Esau and pours out on them lots of blessing as well. When we get to eternity, we don't know how much these different characters ended up knowing or understanding Yahweh. But either which way, God richly blesses them, even though they seem to get the bad end of the stick when they're sent away and not part of the chosen people. Now, during the time of the patriarchs with Abraham and Isaac, we will read about the Philistines. And you're thinking, wait a minute, are there Philistines there at that time? We talked a little bit before. There was a sea peoples that had left the area over by Greece and such, and settled there. And these are just the very early settlements, which is why the kings are not very powerful. And you find the Philistines negotiating and kind of pressuring Isaac, but Isaac, he's not super scared of them either. He doesn't want to upset them, but there seems to be a fairly well balance of power. Isaac just seems to be somebody who backs away and allows them to have what they want. One of the interesting things about Isaac is that he has a fairly simple life. We're not told much about him at all. He does not travel much at all. He doesn't do much at all, period. He doesn't even go find his own wife. Somebody else does that for him. So we don't have a lot with him. He has a run-in with Abimelech, just like his father did. Says that his wife is his sister. Same thing plays out as before. You have the death of his mother. So he was 37 years old when that happens. Abraham purchased the cave at Machpelah to bury Sarah in. That's what you see here, that these monuments are, because Abraham is now buried there as well. And this is the first land owned by Abraham. So up to that point, he's somebody wandering through. So he purchased this land at Hebron. And ends up where they have their first foothold. So they find the bride for Isaac. The servants return to Haran, again, where the relatives were. And God indicates through the servant coming across Rebekah at the well that it would be Rebekah. One of the interesting things about Rebekah and Isaac is that she just shows up and they're married. The whole thing about I use this in my illustration with other students talking about, they think arranged marriages are so horrible. And it's like, here they are. She just walks up and here you are. This is the guy. I hope you like him. She hasn't even seen him. And they immediately go into the tent and consummate the marriage. So it must not have been too bad. And later on, they're flirting before Abimelech. So it must have been a decent marriage. So, but it's an interesting thing to see that how that would have even been to just have this girl walk up and say, "Hi, I'm your bride."
I have another question.
Yes.
Isn't this cave the only property that Abraham had or bought?
Yes. Yes. The question was, is this the only property that Abraham bought? And that is yes.
You mentioned it was the first, but I thought it was the only.
Yeah. First that Israel had a foothold in, and would have been in essence, the center of what they would have focused on, like going back. And I'm trying to remember. I was about to say it would have been where Joseph wanted to be buried, but I don't remember if that's in the same place or not. So you have the interactions with Jacob and Esau that occurs with Isaac and the story of him and the blessing. We're going to get more into that next week when we do the story of Jacob and Esau. But other than that, you really don't have a lot concerning Isaac. Isaac is kind of, he's a secondary figure in Abraham's life and then a secondary figure in Jacob's life, and that's pretty much it. We don't get a lot from him. Then you have Abraham's death. So first, at the death of Sarah, he then marries Keturah and has 6 additional sons, Zimram, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua, all of which, by the way, become nations, but the one we hear the most about then is going to be Midian. And only Isaac was the heir. So none of the possessions went to any of the other children, not Ishmael, not these children. They were given gifts, but no possessions went to them. Isaac was the sole heir of Abraham. Ishmael had already been sent away, and the others, as I said, were given gifts. Abraham dies at 175 years of age, and then Isaac and Ishmael bury him in the cave of Machpelah next to Sarah. So you can see that Isaac and Ishmael, of the two, are the definite sons. The other ones, they probably would have been fairly young at this time, especially compared to their brothers. Now, out of this, you have Jacob that settles this area eventually. Lot, so this is the Moabites, the Ammonites. Esau, because you have the Edomites and then the Amalekites. And then Keturah, because the Midianites settle this area. And then Ishmael with all of his descendants with the Arabs. So Abraham, basically, this whole area are his descendants. So what you have then is Israel, Ammonites, Moabites, Edomites, Amalekites, Arabs, and Midianites. That's it. It's 8 o'clock. I made it. All right. Have a good week. And by the way, we're going to have class next week, but the following 2 weeks, I'm gone to Phoenix and California. So we'll miss class on those days. So, right.
Another question.
Yes.
Is Ishmael also have 12 sons?
Yes, Ishmael also has 12 sons. And even Esau, the way they're given, has 12. Because Amalek is adopted in by somebody else, or one of the other sons is adopted in, and it's listed so that there are 12 under Esau as well. So Ishmael has 12 nations, or 12 that come from him. Esau is seen to have 12, Jacob is seen to have 12, and that's part of why the 12 takes on that concept within Scripture of being, kind of a chosen people kind of thing. So, yep, good question. Thanks. All right, have a good week.